The Starfield watched in horror when humans run from the assembly, the grand chamber of the galactic. Assembly stretched across 17 kilometers of pure crystal and living metal, and within its vast walls gathered the representatives of 4,000 species who had ruled the Milky Way for nearly 1,000,000 cycles. Ambassador Kethra of the Veloci delegation stood near the observation tier, his crystalline skin catching the light of 100 holographic displays as he watched the human delegation enter through the eastern gates. They walked in perfect formation, these strange creatures from a small blue world on the galaxy's outer arm. Their faces showed no emotion, their steps made no sound, and their eyes scanned the chamber with a focus that made Kethra's ancient heart beat faster than it had in centuries. The humans had been members of the Assembly for only 300 years, which meant nothing to species who measured time in geological epochs. They were infants, children who had barely learned to walk among the stars, and yet something about them had always made the elder races uncomfortable in ways they could not name. Kethra had spent decades studying these newcomers. He had read their histories, analyzed their cultures, and observed their behavior with the patience that only a being of his advanced years could possess. What he found disturbed him more than any threat the galaxy had faced in 10,000 cycles. Today, the Assembly had gathered for an emergency session. The Dominion of Ash, a predatory empire from the galactic rim that had terrorized neighboring systems for millennia, had begun expanding again. Their fleets had already claimed 6 border systems, and their appetite showed no signs of slowing. High Counselor Methvon, a massive being of shifting shadows and ancient malice, called the chamber to order with a voice that resonated through every translator device in the room. The vote would be simple, she announced. The Assembly would respond to the Dominion threat by offering appeasement. 12 systems would be surrendered to avoid conflict. 3 of those systems belonged to humanity. Kethra watched the human delegation carefully as this announcement echoed through the chamber. He expected outrage, fury, perhaps even threats of withdrawal from the Assembly. Instead, he saw something far more terrifying. He saw nothing at all. Ambassador Elena Vance rose from her seat with the grace of a creature born for diplomacy. Her silver hair caught the chamber lights as she approached the central speaking platform, and every eye in the room turned toward her small figure standing alone against the might of 4,000 civilizations. Her voice carried clearly through the vast space without any amplification, a trick of human vocal training that never failed to unsettle the other delegates. She presented data showing the Dominion's expansion patterns over the past 5,000 years. She displayed projections indicating that appeasement would only delay the inevitable while strengthening the enemy. She drew parallels to historical conflicts from a dozen different species, including humanity's own troubled past. The Dominion would not stop, she explained calmly. They had never stopped. Every concession the Assembly made would be seen as weakness, and weakness invited destruction. The elder races listened with the patience of beings who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a cosmic shore. They nodded thoughtfully at her arguments, murmured among themselves about the passion of youth, and then voted exactly as they had always intended to vote. The motion passed with an overwhelming majority. Humanity's 3 colony worlds would be sacrificed to preserve the peace that the Assembly valued above all else. Kethra expected Ambassador Vance to protest further. He expected her to threaten withdrawal, to demand reconsideration, to make the kind of dramatic gestures that young species often made when they felt powerless against the machinery of galactic politics. What she did instead would haunt his dreams for the rest of his very long life. She simply nodded. Ambassador Vance gathered her delegation with a small gesture, collected their materials without a word, and began walking toward the exit. There were no angry speeches, no accusations of betrayal, no promises of consequences. There was only silence, deep and complete, and somehow more frightening than any threat could ever be. Elder Counselor Thaxter of the Meridian Collective laughed as he watched the humans depart. His laughter echoed through the chamber like the rumbling of distant thunder, and several other delegates joined him in expressing their amusement at what they perceived as a childish retreat. "The humans run away," Thaxter announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Perhaps they are not so fearsome after all. Perhaps all their talk of warrior, spirits and survival instincts was nothing but posturing from a young species trying to seem more important than they truly are." The chamber filled with polite laughter and dismissive murmurs. The humans were forgotten almost as soon as the doors closed behind them, and the assembly moved on to discuss trade regulations and resource allocation as if nothing significant had occurred. But Kethra did not laugh. He stood frozen at the observation tier, his crystalline form reflecting the casual cruelty of his fellow delegates as they celebrated their perceived victory over the upstart species. His mind raced through everything he had learned about humanity, every historical record, every cultural analysis, every psychological profile. And then he remembered something he had read years ago in a declassified human document. A simple phrase that humans used when they encountered an enemy too powerful to confront directly. They called it strategic withdrawal, and it did not mean what the assembly thought it meant. Humans did not run from fights. They never had, not in all their bloody and magnificent history. The weight of silence, the human delegation's ships detached from eternity's vigil station within 3 hours of the assembly vote, and they entered hyperspace without transmitting a single word of farewell or protest. Kethra watched their departure from his private quarters, his crystalline fingers pressed against the cold viewport glass as the last human vessel vanished into the swirling lights of faster-than-light travel. He told himself that they would return. Surely they would send angry messages, formal complaints, perhaps even threats of economic retaliation. That was how young species behaved when they felt wronged by the Assembly's decisions. But the hours passed, and then the days, and no messages came. Instead, something else began to happen. Human ships throughout Assembly space started withdrawing in perfect synchronization. Trade vessels abandoned profitable routes without explanation. Diplomatic envoys recalled themselves from 100 different worlds. Scientific expeditions packed their equipment and departed research stations they had occupied for decades. All of them moved at once, as if responding to a signal that no one else could hear. The Assembly's intelligence networks tried to intercept communications, to understand what orders the humans were following, but they found nothing. There were no transmissions, no coded signals, no evidence of coordination at all. It was as if every human in the galaxy had simply known what to do without being told. High Counselor Methvon dismissed the withdrawal as a tantrum. She announced that the humans would return once they calmed down and accepted their place in the galactic order. Several other elder counselors agreed, and the Assembly continued its business as if nothing unusual was happening. But Kethra could not dismiss what he was seeing. He locked himself in his quarters and accessed the historical archives, searching through the declassified records that humanity had submitted when they first joined the Assembly. Most delegates had never bothered to read these files, considering human history too short and too primitive to contain anything of value. Kethra read everything. He learned about something called the Monroe Doctrine, a human policy that declared an entire hemisphere of their homeworld off-limits to outside interference. When other nations ignored this warning, the humans have responded with wars that reshaped their planet's political landscape for generations. He read about Pearl Harbor, an attack by one human nation against another that was intended to frighten the defenders into submission. Instead, it awakened something terrible in the attacked nation, a fury so vast and so patient that it did not stop until entire cities had been reduced to radioactive ash. He discovered a phrase that humans used in their diplomacy: speak softly and carry a big stick. It meant that the humans who talked the least were often the ones who hit the hardest. And then he found something that made his crystalline heart stop beating for nearly a full minute. He found records of what humans did when they stopped talking entirely. Throughout their history, human leaders who fell silent were not surrendering. They were preparing. The quiet periods before human conflicts were always the most dangerous, because that was when they gathered their strength, made their plans, and positioned their forces for strikes that their enemies never saw coming. Cathra tried to bring this information to the High Council, but they refused to see him. He sent urgent messages to every delegate he knew, warning them that human silence was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of imminent violence. His warnings were ignored, mocked, or simply deleted without being read. "You have spent too much time studying those primitives," Elder Counselor Thatcher told him during a chance encounter in the station corridors. "Their silence means nothing. They are simply sulking because they did not get their way. They will return to the assembly within a cycle, begging for our protection against the Dominion." Cathra wanted to argue, wanted to scream that they were all making a terrible mistake, but he knew it would do no good. The assembly had decided that humans were not a threat, and the assembly never changed its mind about anything. 3 days after the human withdrawal began, long-range sensors at the edge of assembly space detected something strange. Energy signatures were appearing in human territory, readings so powerful and so unusual that the monitoring stations assumed their equipment had malfunctioned. Technicians ran diagnostics on every sensor, replaced components, and calibrated their instruments with painstaking care. The readings remained unchanged. Something was happening in human space, something that generated more power than any technology the assembly had ever encountered. The energy output from a single source exceeded what most species could produce with their entire civilizations. And there were hundreds of these sources activating simultaneously. Reports began flooding into the assembly from species with colonies near human territory. They spoke of massive structures appearing in systems that have been empty for centuries. They described fleets of warships unlike anything in the galactic catalog, vessels built with technologies that no one had ever seen before. The Meridian Collective sent a scout ship to investigate. It entered human space and was never heard from again. Cathra stood before the assembly one final time, his crystalline body trembling with a fear that had nothing to do with personal danger. He told them what he believed was happening, what the evidence clearly showed, what any reasonable being should have been able to see. The humans were never weak, he said, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent Grand Chamber. They were never primitive, never harmless, never the young and foolish species we believed them to be. For 300 years they pretended to be peaceful, and we believed them because we wanted to believe. He paused, looking around at the thousands of delegates who stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. They joined the assembly hoping to find a family, a community, a reason to abandon their violent past forever. They wanted us to give them a purpose beyond war, and for 3 centuries, they waited for us to accept them as equals. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber. We just told them that their peaceful efforts meant nothing. We just sacrificed their people to save our... The Arsenal Awakens Captain Marcus Cole stood on the bridge of the UEN Prometheus as his ship dropped out of hyperspace into the Sol system. And for a moment, he forgot to breathe. Around him, the birthplace of humanity had transformed into something that would have terrified his ancestors beyond imagination. The forge stations orbited Jupiter like a crown of fire and metal. 12 massive structures that had been built in secret over 3 centuries and hidden behind holographic projections that made them invisible to every sensor in the galaxy. Now they blazed with activity, their construction bays opening to release warships that had been waiting in the darkness for this exact moment. Thousands of vessels emerged from the stations, each one a masterpiece of human engineering that incorporated technologies reverse-engineered from 100 different species. The assembly had shared their knowledge freely, never suspecting that humans were cataloging every advancement, improving every design, and building weapons that made the original technologies look like children's toys. Marcus had served in the United Earth Navy for 30 years, and in all that time, he had never seen the true might of his civilization. The public fleet, the ships that patrolled human space and participated in joint exercises with assembly forces, represented less than 10% of humanity's actual military power. The rest had been hidden, maintained in perfect condition, constantly upgraded with the latest advancements, and crewed by personnel who trained in secret facilities that officially did not exist. These were the ships that human leaders had prayed they would never need to use. Admiral Sarah Chun's face appeared on the main display, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape galactic history. She had commanded the Hidden Fleet for 20 years, preparing for a day that everyone hoped would never come. "All ships have reported in," she announced, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were about to do. "The Sentinel network is online across all 147 systems. The Ragnarok silos are armed and awaiting targeting data." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the silos. He knew what they contained, and the knowledge haunted his dreams. Humanity had sworn never to use such weapons again after they nearly destroyed their own world, but they had never stopped building them. Ambassador Elena Vance appeared on a secondary screen, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the chaos of the past few days. She had returned from the assembly and immediately taken her place in the War Council. Her diplomatic skills now turned toward a very different purpose. "The assembly has made their position clear," she said, and Marcus heard the cold fury beneath her professional tone. "They consider our people expendable. They sacrificed 3 of our worlds without consultation. They laughed as we left their chamber." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice could have frozen stars. "They gave us to the Dominion like scraps thrown to hungry animals. They forgot that we are not prey. We have never been prey. Every species that has ever tried to hunt humanity has learned this lesson, and now we will teach it to the galaxy." The War Council convened via quantum link, connecting leaders from every human colony and installation across their territory. The debate was brief because there was nothing to debate. The assembly had abandoned them. The Dominion was coming for their people, and humanity had only one option left. They would fight. Not the careful, measured, politically acceptable fighting that the assembly practiced, where fleets maneuvered for years and peace treaties were signed before anyone suffered serious casualties. This would be human warfare, the kind that their ancestors had perfected over millennia of bloody conflict. Total war. The vote was unanimous, and with that vote humanity shed 3 centuries of carefully maintained pretense. The mask of the peaceful newcomers, the harmless traders, the curious explorers who posed no threat to anyone, fell away to reveal what had always lurked beneath. Humans were predators, apex killers, who had climbed to the top of their world's food chain through violence and cunning. They had tried to be something else, tried to evolve beyond their nature, tried to become the peaceful civilization they believed the galaxy wanted them to be. But the galaxy had rejected their peace, and now they would show what happened when humans stopped restraining themselves. In the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, massive doors that had been sealed for generations began to open. The Ragnarok silos stretched for hundreds of kilometers through the rocky debris, containing weapons that violated every principle the assembly held sacred. Stellar lances, devices capable of destabilizing a star's core and triggering devastating solar flares. Void bombs, weapons that created temporary rifts in space-time that consumed everything within their radius. Swarm carriers, ships that deployed billions of self-replicating combat drones that could overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers. These weapons had been designed, built, and maintained for 300 years without ever being tested, because testing them would have revealed their existence to the assembly. Human engineers had calculated their effects using theoretical models and hoped that the calculations were accurate. Now they would find out. Captain Marcus Cole received his orders through a secure channel that erased itself immediately after transmission. The Prometheus would lead the first fleet to the New Providence system, where they would wait for the Dominion invasion force to arrive. They would not defend the colony because the colonists had already been evacuated weeks ago, transported to safety by ships that the Assembly never knew existed. Instead, they would prepare a message for the Dominion, a demonstration that would make the entire galaxy understand what humanity was truly capable of. As the message Lord Vasek of the Dominion of Ash stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Flame, watching as his invasion fleet entered the New Providence system. 200 warships, each one a monument to 10,000 years of Dominion conquest, moved in perfect formation toward the small human colony world. He had expected resistance. The humans had a reputation for stubbornness that amused the Dominion High Command. Instead, he found nothing but an empty world and silent orbital stations. "Cowards," he growled, his massive form shifting with barely contained contempt. They abandoned their own people rather than fight. The Assembly was right to give them to us. His tactical officers confirmed that all human vessels had withdrawn from the system. The colony below had been evacuated so thoroughly that not even animals remained. It was as if the humans had known weeks in advance that this invasion would happen. Vasek ordered his fleet to take up positions around the planet. They would claim this world for the Dominion, strip it of resources, and use it as a staging ground for the next phase of their expansion. The humans had made this easy. Then the star flickered. At first Vasek thought his eyes were deceiving him. Stars did not flicker, not like that, not in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. He turned to his science officer and demanded an explanation. The officer's scales went pale as she studied her instruments. "Lord Vasek," she said, her voice trembling in a way that Vasek had never heard from one of his crew. "Something is happening to the star. Energy patterns are forming at its core. Artificial patterns, patterns that should not be possible." Vasek did not understand what she was saying, but he understood fear. He had spent his entire life inspiring fear in others, and he recognized it instantly when he saw it in his officer's eyes. "What is happening?" he demanded. Before she could answer, the star erupted. A column of pure stellar fire exploded outward from the sun's surface, a controlled flare that had been triggered by a device hidden in the star's corona for decades. The flare was precisely calculated, aimed with inhuman accuracy, and powerful enough to scour everything in its path from existence. Lord Vasek had exactly 3 seconds to realize what was happening before the wave of superheated plasma struck his flagship. The Eternal Flame lived up to its name as it burned, along with every other ship in the Dominion fleet. 200 warships, 2 million soldiers, the pride of an empire that had terrorized the galaxy for 10 millennia, were reduced to atoms in 17 seconds. The light of their destruction traveled outward at the speed of physics, and every species with long-range sensors watched in real time as humanity announced its return to the galactic stage. On Eternity's vigil, the Grand Chamber fell silent as the display showed the devastation at New Providence. 4,000 species stared at the evidence of a weapon that should not exist, a technology that violated every understanding of stellar physics that the Assembly possessed. Kethra watched from the observer gallery, his crystalline body reflecting the hellish light of the dying Dominion fleet. He felt no satisfaction in being proven right, no vindication in the Assembly's shock. He felt only sorrow for what was about to happen. Then the message arrived. It broadcast on every frequency, in every language, to every world with the capability to receive transmissions. It appeared on displays in government offices and private homes, on military vessels and civilian stations, in the assembly chamber, and in the throne rooms of 1,000 different civilizations. A human woman appeared on the screen, her silver hair and formal uniform marking her as someone of authority. Her face showed no anger, no triumph, no emotion at all. She spoke with the calm precision of someone delivering a weather report. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Navy," she began. "The entity known as the Dominion of Ash has been found guilty of unprovoked aggression against human territory and human lives. In accordance with the laws of our people, we have passed sentence." She paused, and in that pause the galaxy held its breath. "The sentence is total war. There will be no negotiations, no truces, no surrender terms that leave the Dominion intact. We will dismantle your empire system by system until nothing remains but memory and warning." Her eyes seemed to look directly at every being watching, as if she could see through the displays and into their souls. "To the Dominion leadership, you have 14 standard cycles to surrender unconditionally. For every cycle you delay, we will destroy one of your systems. This is not a threat. It is a schedule." Then her gaze shifted, becoming somehow colder. "To the Galactic Assembly, you made your position clear when you voted to sacrifice our people. You chose to stand aside. We accept your choice. This war is no longer your concern, and we neither request nor require your involvement. Stay out of our way, and no harm will come to you. Interfere, and you will learn that the Dominion is not the only entity capable of experiencing human justice." The screen went dark for a moment, then displayed a countdown timer. 14 cycles remaining. In the assembly chamber, chaos erupted. Delegates screamed accusations at each other, demanded emergency sessions, called for sanctions and peacekeeping forces and diplomatic interventions. High Counselor Methvon tried to restore order, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of species who had suddenly realized that the galaxy had changed forever. Kethra turned away from the spectacle and walked to the great viewport that overlooked the stars. Out there, somewhere in the darkness, humanity was preparing to wage the kind of war that the Assembly had forgotten was possible. He thought about the human histories he had studied, about the wars they had fought among themselves before they reached for the stars. They had burned cities, poisoned lands, split atoms over civilian populations. They had committed horrors that would have made the Dominion seem merciful by comparison. And then they had stopped. They had looked at what they were capable of and been horrified by their own reflection. They had clawed their way towards civilization, built institutions designed to restrain their worst impulses. The Starfield watches 8 months later. Kethra stood at the same viewport where he had wept on the day of humanity's declaration, and he watched the final chapter of the Dominion of Ash unfold in the distant stars. The Dominion had not surrendered. Their leaders had laughed at humanity's ultimatum, confident that their ancient empire could withstand any assault from a species that had barely existed for a cosmic heartbeat. They had mobilized their reserves, fortified their strongholds, and prepared for a war that would add another conquered species to their long list of victories. They had been wrong. True to their word, the humans had destroyed one Dominion system for every cycle that passed without surrender. They used their stellar lances to trigger flares that sterilized worlds, their void bombs to erase space stations from existence, their swarm carriers to overwhelm defensive fleets with billions of autonomous weapons. The Dominion responded with everything they had, throwing ships and soldiers and resources at the human advance, but nothing they did could slow the destruction. Human tactics were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, combining surgical precision with overwhelming force in ways that defied conventional military doctrine. They did not conquer systems. They erased them. They did not occupy worlds. They quarantined them. They did not take prisoners. They offered one chance to surrender. and those who refused simply ceased to exist. The Assembly tried to intervene twice during the 8-month campaign. The first time, they sent a diplomatic envoy to negotiate a ceasefire. The humans allowed the envoy to land on one of their stations, listened politely to the Assembly's proposal, and then sent the diplomats home with a simple message: "This does not concern you." The second intervention was more aggressive. The Assembly gathered a peacekeeping fleet of 3,000 ships from a dozen different species and positioned them between the human advance and a major Dominion stronghold. They believed that humanity would not dare to fire on Assembly vessels. Admiral Chun's response was broadcast across the galaxy. "You have positioned yourselves between us and our enemy," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You have 10 minutes to withdraw. If you remain, you will share their fate. This is not negotiable." The peacekeeping fleet stayed for 9 minutes before their commanders realized that humanity was not bluffing. They scattered in every direction, abandoning their mission and their pride, fleeing from a species they had once dismissed as harmless newcomers. No one tried to stop the humans after that. The Dominion of Ash, an empire that had terrorized the galactic rim for 10,000 years, collapsed in 8 months. Their homeworld was surrounded by a blockade that would remain in place for generations. Their fleets were reduced to debris. Their colonies were occupied by human forces who began the long process of cultural rehabilitation. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as a species that had existed for barely a cosmic instant dismantled one of the oldest powers in known space. And then, as suddenly as it began, the human war machine went quiet. Their warships returned to the hidden stations around Jupiter. The forge stations went dark. The Ragnarok silos sealed themselves once more. Within weeks, the only evidence of humanity's true military power was the wreckage of the Dominion and the memories of those who had witnessed their fury. 3 days after the war ended, Ambassador Elena Vance returned to Eternity's Vigil. She walked through the same eastern gates she had exited 8 months before, but this time, the Grand Chamber did not fill with dismissive laughter. 4,000 species watched in absolute silence as she took her seat at the human delegations table, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her expression revealing nothing. High Counselor Methvon struggled to maintain her composure as she called the session to order. Her voice trembled in ways that it had never trembled before, and her shifting form seemed somehow smaller than it had been. "Ambassador Vance," she began, choosing her words with obvious care. "The Assembly wishes to discuss the recent conflict and its implications for galactic relations." Elena smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course, High Counselor. We are always happy to discuss matters of mutual interest with our fellow Assembly members." She paused, looking around the chamber at the thousands of delegates who could not meet her gaze. "But first, I believe there were some trade agreements we were discussing before we were so rudely interrupted. Shall we return to those negotiations, or would the Assembly prefer to spend more time contemplating recent events?" No one spoke. No one dared to challenge her. No one even suggested that humanity should face consequences for the destruction they had caused. The Assembly had learned the lesson that the Dominion learned too late. Humanity was not a species to be dismissed, manipulated, or sacrificed for the convenience of others. They were predators who had chosen to live as peaceful beings, and that choice could be revoked at any moment. Kethra watched from the observer gallery as the session continued, and he thought about everything he had learned over the past year. He thought about human history, about their wars and their peace treaties, about their capacity for both incredible violence and remarkable mercy. He understood now what the Assembly had never grasped. Humans did not run from their enemies. They had never run from external threats in all their bloody history. When humans fled, They were not escaping from something outside themselves. They were running from something inside. For 300 years, humanity had run from their own nature, fleeing across the stars in search of a future where they would never need to be. What their ancestors had been. They had joined the assembly hoping to find acceptance, community, a reason to believe that they could be more than just very efficient killers. The assembly had rejected them, and in doing so, had forced them to stop running. They had turned and faced what they truly were, and the galaxy had trembled. Ambassador. Vance caught Kethra's eye as she spoke about trade regulations and resource allocation. And for just a moment, her professional mask slipped. He saw exhaustion in her face and sorrow and the weight of decisions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had not wanted this. None of them had wanted this. They had tried so hard to be something else, but the galaxy had refused to let them be peaceful. And now everyone would live with the consequences. The session ended, and the delegates filed out of the chamber in subdued silence. There were no dismissive laughs, no casual insults, no assumptions about humanity's place in the galactic order. There was only fear, respect, and the understanding that everything had changed. Kethra